Morning.
Good morning. Okay, let me share the screen and let's get started. Okay, so what we were learning yesterday is that we have to distinguish between when one has to obey the law of the king because it's dina de malchusa, and when it's not considered the law of the king because the king is acting in an unfair, indiscriminate way, and is doing something tyrannical by confiscating property from one party and not from others. So in that situation, it's no longer dina de malchusa, and instead it is gezel. And not only that, but you would not be allowed to benefit if the king were to take property that's not according to dina de malchusa. You would not be allowed to benefit because that's considered to be gezel. And then he said something. The Imrei Yaakov says in Kuf Lamed Beis, he says, "Klalo shel davar, kol din sheyachkok oso hamelech lakol." If the king institutes a rule that is equal for all of the subjects, v'lo yihiyeh la'adam echad bifnei atzmo, and it's not discriminated against one person, eino gezo. Aval im lokeach mi'ish ze bilvad. But if he confiscates property from one individual, and he does so based on a whim, it's not based upon a well-known law that's in the books. And that's the reason why it's called dina de malchusa and not dina de malka. Dina de malchusa means it's a government law, not the whatever the edict of the king is. Because sometimes if the king does not himself abide by the governmental principles, then he cannot just whimsically confiscate property. Okay? But if the king unfairly confiscates from one small geographic area, the Choshen gozer rak al ir echas, or decrees on one city, then de lo amrinan bazeh dina de malchus adin. But then at the end of the halacha, the Rav Shulchan Aruch said something very surprising. He said, if, however, im makol makom im gozer ala Yehudim sheyitnu mechas o davar acher yoter mehagoyim nikra mashve midosa. If the king institutes a special tax on the Jews, then that's still called dina de malchusa, even though it's not the same tax that's imposed upon the rest of the citizens. And the reason is me'achar shekol haYehudim nosnim b'shaveh, because all of the Jews are paying an equal amount. In other words, no one Jew is being singled out. It's just the Jews in general. And on this, the Imrei Yaakov says, Im gozer ala Yehudim, hu hadin im gozer al hadirim she'ina mimedino so shaper habidina de malchusa. If the king decrees on strangers, in other words, there's one law that applies to the indigenous people of the land, people who are natural citizens of the country, and there's a separate tax that applies to immigrants, let's say. That's what you would call gerim, are people who are not indigenous or are not naturalized citizens, that if you're not a citizen, but you're just a visitor, then he imposes a special tax on those people. That's still called dina de malchusa dina because he's treating everyone with the same policy. And that he says, perhaps, well, we'll see in just a moment. Avalo b'davar prati. And then he finishes off by saying, he says, even if the king appropriates or taxes everyone equally, but he does so to serve himself and not a public interest, that's also not called dina de malchusa dina. And also, the last thing that he said is that if the king wants to institute a law that does not pertain to the public good, but rather interferes between interpersonal financial dealings, then that's not called Dina de Malchusa either, because you will have nullified all the laws of the Torah if you allow Dina de Malchusa to interfere into financial dealings that are between two people. And that's what we had left off yesterday. He says, "The law Amrinan Dina de Malchusa Dina, ela bameshu midine hamalucha." We only say Dina de Malchusa Dina as it pertains to the laws or the rules of the government or the kingdom. Aval dvarim shedanim be'erkaot ein elo mimishpat hamalucha. But things that are adjudicated between two private parties in a court of law does not fall under the rubric of governmental law that we have to abide by, ella ha'arkos danim ba'atzmam, but rather these are judged independently of the king. Kamoshi yetsu b'sifrei dayonehem, va'afilu im gozer hamelech behedje lelech achar dinei ha'arkos ein al dayoni Yisrael l'kayem zeh. In other words, the courts have a certain autonomy and are different from the government edicts, because the government makes rules that preserve the greater good of the public welfare, and the court system is there to adjudicate conflicts that are between private parties. And the court system has its own sets of laws, and the king therefore does not interfere with the court system. And that's the reason why, if you don't, that's why you're not obliged to go through the court system because of Dina de Malchusa. That seems to be what he's saying. And this is true even if the king orders all his subjects to go through the court system. Ein al dayani Yisrael l'kayem zeh. The Jewish judges may not conform to this. Da'al zeh lo amru Dina de Malchusa. He says, Dina, because that's outside the purview of Dina de Malchusa. And the reason is, it's like the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said, because if we would allow the government to interfere in how we adjudicate our financial differences, she'im lo kein batalta dinei haTorah chas v'shalom, because then all Torah law will be nullified if we have to do everything according to what the government tells us to do. Ule'inyan tashlum chobos kishenishtana o nifsal hamatbeya. He says, and what do you do if there's a debt and that debt or the rules of that debt are governed by governmental law, which means, let's say the government says what currency is legal to pay with and what currency is not legal to pay with. All right, so that's a separate question, which you can take a look at. There will sometimes be intersections between the government and the courts. So, for example, if the government says certain currency is legal tender and old currency is no longer legal tender, that's under the purview of the government. The courts, therefore, will sometimes have to adjudicate on issues where the government has an involvement in. So that's a maneuverable situation where you may have to abide by Dina de Malchusa in that situation. But in normal situations where the court system is independent of the monarchy, you have to abide by a beis din and not go to the courts whenever you have a personal dispute with a fellow Jew. And I guess that's the way that we're distinguishing between the obligation to abide by Dina de Malchusa Dina and not going to a secular court to adjudicate your differences or conflicts with a fellow Jew. Okay. So I just wanted to go through the rest of that halacha. Now let's go back to this issue that if the king decrees on all Jews an equal tax, a Jew tax, that is within the purview of the king, and that's called Dina de Malchusa. So let's take a look at the biurim and see why that is. He says, Din ze kasaf hamaharik shorish kuf tzadi dalid, ve'etiko harama simin shin samach tes sif davav. He basically tells us what the source of this halacha is. It is cited by the Rama in Shulchan Aruch. Ulahalan sham sifches hetika Rama odin shegam kein mekoro midivrei hamarik. And the Rama later says another law that is based in the Maharik, this medieval commentary. The Im Hamelech chakak chok lebal umnus echad kegon lemalva beribis. That, for example, let's say the king passes legislation, makes a royal rule about all people in a certain profession, like there are certain parameters of how to practice your profession, but it applies to everyone equally. So, for example, to money lenders, okay, the king makes a standard rule: Vishina oso mishar bali umnius delom rinan bazedina de malchusadin, and he makes a standard that is different from all other professionals, or all other professions. So, let's say the king makes a rule that if you're a blacksmith, if you're a farmer, if you're a wagon driver, so then you don't have to forfeit a certain amount of your income to the crown. But if you're a money lender, there's a higher tax that you have to pay, or a certain penalty that you have to pay to the government because of your profession. And so there the Rama says, since the king is unfairly singling out one group of one type of occupation, you don't have to follow Dina de Malchusadina because the king is being unfairly discriminatory. Okay, so whole veino chalkuk lakol. So this seems to be a contradiction in the halacha. He says v'lechora yesh litmoa dishnei dinim elu sosrim atzmam. He says it seems like that these two halachos are contradictory. The first halacha being that if there's a special Jew tax that is within the purview of Dina de Malchusadina, but if there's a special occupation tax, there that the king is overstepping and therefore you don't have to pay it. He says De'im Dina de Malchusadina, who rakecha shuhu mashva midosa ve'enu machalik ben hatoshavim. He says because if Dina de Malchusa only applies when the king is equitable to everybody and does not discriminate between one type of subject and another, im kain my taima kishuhu mishane et haYehudim mishar toshavim yesh bo dina de malchuta. He says, then why is it that when there's a special Jew tax that is considered halachically fair, and you have to obey that law? Uve'emes shahagrasham sifkatan lamed gimel hirgish bazeh v'kasav b'tzarachiyim. The Vilna Gaon was disturbed by this halacha, and he writes so in his commentary in a cryptic way. He says, "B'tzarachiyun." He says this needs more analysis. Avol gam harav kan hebi eshtei hadinim. But the Rav Shulchan Aruch brings both of these halachas. Umuchach desvirale de'ein kan shum stira, and therefore he's of the opinion that there is no contradiction. Amnam lo bi'er lanu hatam, but he doesn't tell us why there's no contradiction. It would seem to me, in my humble opinion, says Rav Stern, that the difference is as follows. That if you look at the original source, which is the Maharik for this halach in Shulchan Aruch, Yira dehevi siyata midivrei harambam shekasav sheim hasar yomar she'eno chafetz sheshum Yehudi yagur kan ki im birshus Ruvain. He says that he quotes a halacha from the Rambam, who writes that if a government official writes that I don't want any Jews living in a certain area, you can only live in Ruvain's neighborhood. The Ruvain yachol la'akev medina de malchusadina ayin sham. And then that the halacha is that Ruvain can also argue with the government and can prevent the government from forcing all Jews to live only in his neighborhood. He can prevent Jews from moving into his neighborhood as well. So that's what the Maharik says. So let's try and understand that. He says, "Umash masham hatam dehoil v'hasar yachol legaresh et haYehudim shehem toshavim zarim be'artzo." It seems that the reason is that the government official always has the option of ejecting the Jews from his land because the Jews are not considered to be indigenous. By definition, Jews are wandering, and therefore no country is considered to be the homeland of Jews. Lachein shaykh bazeh dina de malchusa. He says, and based on that, um, there's basically a rule that the king can basically eject Jews from the land whenever he wants. V'lachein ho'elu bein haYehudim atzmam enu mechalek u'mashve midosav legabe kulam b'shana. Since the government is not distinguishing between different kinds of Jews, but is including all Jews within its rules, even though the government is making a distinction between the other citizens and the Jews, and is discriminating against the Jews, there still is the rule of Dina de Malchusa, based on the fact that the king is treating all the Jews equally. And the way that I think what he's trying to suggest is that Jews are considered to be a foreign class in any country. And if a king wants to treat a foreign class differently from naturalized citizens of the country, he has a right to do so. That's a very foreign way of thinking today, because today we are all about, giving everyone equal rights and opening up the borders and everything like that. But consider that that's a relatively new phenomenon. What if the argument is made that Jews are guests in our country, we tolerate them, but they are still a foreign entity? And if that's the attitude, then we are allowed to tax a foreign visitor, let's say, to our country at a higher rate than we tax the naturalized citizens. And he says that's the same idea that the Maharshal writes when he says that the king is within his rights to tax foreigners at a higher rate than people who are natural citizens. And in that way, we would be able to reconcile the apparent contradiction. When the king unfairly taxes natural citizens differently from other natural citizens, so then that's not considered to be within the purview of Dina de Malchusa Dina, because he's treating two different kinds of natural citizens two different ways, and that double standard is not acceptable. But when he taxes Jews differently from everyone else, it falls under the rubric of taxing a foreign visitor, and that's the reason why Jews are treated differently, and that is considered to be within the purview of Dina de Malchusa Dina. And even when the king or the government doesn't have the legal ability to eject the Jews from his land, but since the Jews are considered foreigners vis-a-vis all of the other citizens of the country, then it is fair, or it is within the realm of Dina de Malchusa to discriminate against them. And therefore, it's not considered to be discriminating against the same kind of subjects because they are considered foreigners vis-a-vis the rest of the citizenry. So I want to just reflect on this for a moment. I hope that it's clear what he said. Essentially, the way that Rav Stern has framed this is that the reason why the Shulchan Aruch says that you are allowed to, government is allowed to tax Jews at a different rate from everybody else, is because Jews are considered to be a foreigner class within the subjects of the kingdom. Okay, does everyone hear that? Everyone appreciate that point? Jews are. What's that?
To the extreme, you could take this to Nazi Germany.
Well, I mean, if the only right that a government has is to eject people who are not its citizens, you don't have a right to commit genocide. So, the thing that was so horrific about Nazi Germany is not that they treated Jews in a discriminatory fashion, because let's face it, Jews have been ejected from countries for centuries. Portugal ejected its Jews, Spain ejected its Jews, and Jews were forced to travel from one part of the world to another. That's been the story of the Jewish people. The part that is truly evil is not that we kick you out, but rather that we murder you, that we either force you to convert, or we basically decide that you can't continue living. That's the part that's truly evil. So just sort of to reflect on this for a moment, is this halacha not really suggesting that there really is no place on the planet except for Eretz Yisrael where Jews are even halachically considered to be natural citizens, or real, true subjects of the country? And that's really the attitude that seems to be emerging from this halacha. That's really the reason, is that as comfortable as we may become in a country, we have to sort of submit that if we're foreigners, we consider ourselves foreigners. But if the government itself considers us a foreign class, that's actually not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, because it's the reality. We don't belong here.
What about North America, where everybody is non-indigenous?
Well, yeah, if you have a melting pot like the US, then I would agree with you, Izzy. I think that the argument could be made that treating one class of non-indigenous people differently from another class of non-indigenous people would be not in accord with Dina de Malchusa. So I think you might be able to make that argument.
Sorry. And how do you deal with the blacks in America that were brought in against their will?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The thing is that it would be probably more unfair to tax the blacks at a different rate than to tax the Jews at a different rate. At least the Jews came here voluntarily. The blacks were forced to come here. So that would probably be challenged by a court of law also, as far as whether the government has a right. But look, thankfully, when you live in a country where no one is indigenous, or virtually no one is indigenous, so then it's easier for Jews to blend in, because we're just one more non-indigenous people. But remember, that's not typical of our history, the way we live today, right? Okay.
So what if a Jew works for a conquering king?
A Jew works for what?
A conquering king.
Okay.
The British decide they're going to go into India, and the Jews are helping them take over the whatever. Is a Jew still considered
a foreigner
by halacha?
I don't know. I think it may depend, but you're getting into the finer points of at what point does a Jew become a non-foreigner. But the general rule is that at least through our medieval history, Jews were treated differently, and Jews were segregated from the rest of the population, and unfairly so in many instances. But that's the way it was, because the government only tolerated the Jews. They didn't welcome the Jews to come in as to become full-fledged citizens. And I think it was only probably, I don't know, maybe within the last 150 years, that Jews were allowed to become citizens of Poland and Germany and things like that. I don't know. It's worth spending some time thinking about this, thinking about the social order of various different countries where Jews have lived, and recognizing that there is some logic to this, even though it may be disturbing. It's a disturbing logic, but it's a logic nonetheless, and it also is really reflective of of who we are as a people, and where we belong and where we don't belong. And maybe this halacha could have been designed as a psychological product of our diaspora existence, just to sort of listen. We have no choice. We have to accept Dina de Malchusa. Otherwise, it could be that it's just a concession to reality. Also, this halacha. Because if we tell Jews not to pay the Jew tax, it'll end up in a huge pogrom in many different countries. Jews have to pay the Jew tax, because if you don't, look what's going to happen. If Jews refuse and they try to get away without paying, the government's just going to kick all the Jews out of the country. So I don't know. I don't know whether that could be part of the reason why this halacha is in the books. I don't know. But that's the reason why it's so foreign to us is because we do live in the Western world, where most countries today are not comprised of its original citizenry. Even places like Germany, which has a huge and long history of its indigenous German people. Now, probably over 10% of its citizens are foreigners. It's probably most of Europe today. So unfortunately, it's Muslims that come from the Orient, and that changes the whole character of the country. But that's just the way it is. Okay, let me wish you all a good Shabbos, and we'll continue with the next halacha on Monday, Bezrat Hashem. Okay?
Thank you. Good Shabbos.